So when we think about what makes a job attractive, it's not just about the paycheck. Of course, that's important, but there's a lot of other factors that we consider when choosing a job. Things like the flexibility of the schedule, job security, and working conditions. These non-monetary job characteristics, what we call amenities, can play a big role in a person's job satisfaction. But here's the key. Jobs that offer better amenities, more vacation time, safer working conditions, often come with lower wages, while jobs with fewer of those perks often have to pay more to attract workers. This is part of what we call compensating differentials. Wages adjust to account for the desirability or undesirability about job characteristics. Initially, we just focused on safety, and part of that is because that's the most striking and simplest example. But we can also look at the other characteristics of these jobs to see the same trade-off in action. So for example, a job that requires long hours and unpredictable layoffs, where you could get fired at any time without, much warning or expectation, the odds are they will need to pay more to attract workers compared to ones that have regular hours and better job security. Interestingly, we often assume these trade-offs exist. However, the evidence is fairly mixed, except in cases where the risk of death is involved. High-risk jobs do tend to pay more, but for other job amenities, the wage differences aren't always so clear-cut. So how do things like job security, work hours, or safety factor into wage differences? And I'm talking more general safety than, of course, the actual death. Some of the problem is that it's difficult to actually account for and isolate just one of these characteristics. So any study that is trying to estimate those has a really difficult time holding everything else constant and focusing on just that one little difference. And I think that's the biggest problem for being unable to estimate these amenities. I just want to highlight this again, that it should come as no surprise that jobs with good characteristics offer lower wages than those with worse characteristics. So for a place with 3 shifts, if you're looking at like manufacturing, the night shift often pays better than the day shift. I worked a job that had all 3 shifts. It actually wasn't in a factory, it was somewhere else. And I typically worked second shift, which wasn't bad. It wasn't as good as day shift, but it was still pretty good. But I would also pick up third shifts every now and then if I had, nothing going on, because I could make a lot more money for just picking up those extra 8 hours. It takes a lot more to get people to work third shift, so they end up paying more money. On the other hand, people complain all the time about low wages in academia. New positions are often non-tenure track, which is an amenity that a lot of people appreciate in academia. And they often pay very low, like $50,000 per year, and there's almost no job security. But the reason they do that is academia is a great lifestyle for so many. So the wages often reflect that. And because so many people would like to work in that environment, they're able to offer low wages. Now let's look at one specific example. A textbook goes through the probability or likelihood of layoffs and how that affects compensating differentials. So we use unemployment insurance. This is through a government program to protect workers from the risk of layoffs. But you could ask, what if layoffs are priced into workers' wages? It should be obvious to workers that in some high-risk industries that have a lot of turnover, that the risk would be priced in, that it's something that they can anticipate ahead of time. Unlike some industries where I'm sure it is more likely for people to get laid off, but it's not expected. Workers don't see that difference ahead of time. So we can use the standard neoclassical labor-leisure model from earlier in the course and use it to compare 2 jobs, one which is regular year-round and one that's a seasonal job. So point P represents the point for the full-time year-round job. So at this point, they have a leisure L0, which corresponds to H0 hours of work. Point Q here represents the part-time job. Has L1, so more hours of leisure, which corresponds to H1 or fewer hours of work. Again, because they're only working for a part of the year. If that firm tried to pay the same wage for the part-time seasonal workers and for the full-time year-round workers, what we would see is that no one would want to take the seasonal job. This utility curve down here, remember for the workers' labor, leisure, supply model, the closer you get to the origin, the lower utility you have. So this is a much lower level of utility than point P up here. So given the choice between the two, no worker would choose this. They would choose point P. Or some will have extenuating circumstances. Maybe they got fired right for the holidays or something like that. But in general, given the choice between the two, they're going to choose point P. So how could a firm get a worker to work seasonally? Thing they would have to do is increase the wages. So originally, they're both making the same wage. If we increase the wage to W1, so now we have a steeper wage curve. If you increase the wage, the hourly wage high enough, you could get up to point R here, which matches the same amount of leisure and hours worked throughout the year. So you have that same seasonal job is now paying a higher wage. Annually, you're still making less money, but their hourly wages are going to be much higher than before. And that's how you can get some people to work seasonally. At point R, the worker is going to be indifferent between the two jobs because they're both on the same utility curve. Now, this can also apply to jobs like construction, where you can't work year-round, at least in places like West Virginia or Pennsylvania, or jobs with a high chance of being laid off. It takes much higher wages to attract people to these jobs, especially when you're either guaranteed or very, very likely to be out of a job for at least some of the year.